When we begin our practice along the Buddhist Eightfold Path, we begin with right view. And to be honest, this is jumping into the deep end of the pool, because the subject of right view, after all, is the subject of wisdom itself, which can be understood to be the whole goal of the path. So we don't begin with a completed understanding of right view. And I would say that you're in good luck, you have good luck, because you're interested in the Eightfold Path. So to that extent, you already begin with some glimmer of right view, an understanding that there is possibly a better and a worse that we can gain in our lives, and there's a reason to practice something. Now in today's video, I'll be making background use of Bhante Henepola Gunaratana's book, 8 Mindful Steps to Happiness. This is an old copy. I'm not going to be following it precisely, however, I'll leave a link to his book down below in the notes. It has a lot of practice tips, and if you want to read more about the whole idea of the practice, that's a good place to start. I also have a course over at the Online Dharma Institute on the Eightfold Spiral Path, and I'll leave a link to that down below in the notes as well. Now, Bhante Gunaratana calls this skillful understanding, which is sort of a free translation of the Pali that means basically right view. So where does right view begin? Right view begins with our awareness that there are some things that we can do and intend that are good for us and good for other people, and other things that are bad. And we also, along with that awareness, have a wish to increase the former, that is to say, do more of the things that are good for ourselves and others, and to do less of the things that are bad for ourselves and others. This may seem obvious, but it seems that some people have trouble with this and end up, in fact, we will probably know that even though this seems obvious, not only other people, but we ourselves find ourselves doing the opposite all too often. So to undo this tendency we have to work in ways that are to our own detriment and to the detriment of other people, we want to have some kind of a practice. And that's the idea of the path that we are embarking upon. Now, we have to also be aware that we make mistakes. As I've just said, we're doing the wrong thing all the time. We have to be aware of the fact that we are not perfect. That's part, in fact, we might even say that's part of our own right view at the beginning, is the understanding that we ourselves are not perfect, that we're not going to be able to execute all of the things we want to do with perfect efficiency. We're going to make mistakes. And so that's part of our understanding here. The Buddha had a famous discussion with his son Rahula about actions like these. And the Buddha suggested that his son Rahula would be best served to contemplate his actions before he did them. It would be nice for all of us to do that. But the Buddha was aware that Rahula wouldn't always end up doing that. So the Buddha said, if you can't contemplate your actions before you do them, reflect on them after you've done them. Or, of course, reflect on them while you're doing them, but even if that fails, at least reflect on them after the fact. How do they make you feel? This is part of our practice. When we talk about practicing right view, part of that practice is to become aware of the character of our actions, to become aware of which actions seem to be to our benefits and which actions, on further reflection, seem not to have been. Now, to give some pointers here, in early Buddhism, there is the idea that actions that are based upon intentions of greed and hatred tend to be those that are not to our benefit, tend to be those that are not to the benefit of others around us. So hatred in particular is this kind of intuitive sense we have that we want to harm other people, that we want to get back at them, that we want revenge upon them perhaps. We want them to do badly. Similarly, greed involves desires of a certain kind. It's not all desires that are greedy, but desires that are excessive, desires for things that we don't really need or that in fact are to our detriment in some fashion or other, such as the kinds of desires that come up when we are addicted in certain ways. The commonality between these kinds of intentions that arise out of anger and out of greed is the role of ego. ego being the driving force of these kinds of negative urges that we have, that we all have. Now the question is, how do these urges then end up conditioning our actions and conditioning our behavior? Because, among other things, right view involves an understanding of the way this kind of conditioning works. It involves our understanding, our growing awareness that, for example, acting out of anger conditions further anger. If we ourselves act out of anger, it conditions others to act out of anger in response to us, just sort of perpetuating this cycle. And similarly, acting out of egoistic intentions, let's say egoistic greed, also has negative effects on others around us. So this right view involves our growing understanding of the ways in which we do not act in a vacuum. Our actions are conditioned by others around us, of course, but also our actions condition the actions of others. And so our practice, therefore, is to investigate these conditions, perhaps in a mindfulness practice. That is to say, we may do some form of meditation, either formal meditation or at least taking time, a little bit of time to ourselves to contemplate our intentions and our actions, and to decide or feel whether they seem to be beneficial or not. How do they make us feel in a kind of a grounded sense? Do they make us feel good? Do they make us feel bad? That's the kind of intention that we want to put to our intentions. That's the kind of attention we want to put to our actions. Another central aspect to right view is our awareness that life involves suffering. Now, some may view this as a kind of a pessimistic way to begin a philosophy or a practice, but in fact it's realistic. To view the world through rose-colored glasses is to set ourselves up for severe disappointment in the future. However, having a realistic view, a right view of the way life unfolds, allows us to be better prepared when the inevitable actually happens, such as the arising of old age, the arising of illness, the arising of death. These are unpleasant facts that we all have to deal with. As a result, having such a right view allows us to prepare for these eventualities in a way that's effective for us, in a way that actually is helpful, is skillful, is healthy for us. Now, that said, the pleasures of life are very real. We don't want to deny them. However, pleasures such as the ones that we encounter in daily life are also temporary. It's good to keep that in mind. The world is a world of constant change. We may ask ourselves why it is that change is a problem or becomes a problem. Why isn't it we can't just simply roll with the punches, roll with the change, and accept it? Well, it's something to investigate. What is it that's going on in our mind that makes change difficult for us? That's another aspect of the practice that can lead towards right view. What is it that makes change into suffering? That makes us suffer when change happens? Well, the early Buddhist right view about this is that suffering comes through craving. In particular, we crave certain kinds of permanence that simply aren't available to us. We crave that the pleasant goes on forever and that the painful never arrives. But of course, as we've just said, these are things we cannot have. The pleasurable, what's pleasant to us will eventually end, and painful things such as old age, illness, and death are inevitable. I think it was Benjamin Franklin who said the only two certainties in life are death and taxes, and that's kind of the point here. Further, these kinds of cravings that we have are bound up in forms of ego identification. So, for example, I've known several people who enjoyed particular sports that they were really good at playing. And they became ego-identified with their ability to do well in those sports. They thought of themselves as a good, tennis player or whatever it might be. And unfortunately, but necessarily, essentially, eventually at a certain point in their lives, they were no longer able to play that sport at the same level and indeed had to give the sport up entirely. And the result was suffering. Now, there's of course pain involved with aging, there's pain involved with injury, and the aging and injury may be what makes us give up, let's say, a sport. But the pain is one thing and the suffering is additional. The suffering is what comes from this kind of breaking of our ego identification. Something that we thought was part of us, that we identified with, we're no longer able to achieve. And this is the way that we can see the other side of our tendency to ego identify with those things that we find pleasurable and successful, that we're successful at, and to ego identify in ways that are in opposition to things that we find painful or unpleasant. Similarly, others of us may identify ourselves with a job that we have, or with our house, our home, a place that we live. And then, in time, things change. Either we're fired, or we have to retire, or we lose our job for some reason. Then we're at loose ends. We're no longer the person that we thought we were. Similarly, at some point in our lives, we may have to move. Maybe we have to go to a home for older people because we can no longer maintain our lifestyle in the home that we've been in for decades. Again, becomes an issue of suffering because we're not able to completely understand the facts of life in this sense, the change in life, and the fact that all things, including these facts of our ego, are going to eventually evaporate. Now, of course, there are unbounded numbers of examples of similar kinds of ways that we can ego identify. And the practice here is to become aware of this. Again, this is a form of right view, viewing and understanding the ways that the mind works. To be aware of the identification, to be aware of the clinging, the craving when it happens, and to let it go. Or at least be aware that we should practice towards letting it go. So far, we've discussed a number of different aspects to right view. To begin with, right view involves the understanding that there is a difference between the skillful and the unskillful in our intentions and in our actions. It also involves an awareness that there's causal conditioning involved in both our intentions themselves, the way that our intentions are conditioned by outside forces, as well as the ways that our intentions and actions condition things in the outside world, condition reactions in other people, for example. Right view involves the understanding that all things change, including the ego, that as we become ego-identified with various aspects of reality, we are setting ourselves up for suffering. And right view involves what we might term the Four Noble Truths, an awareness, a view towards the facts of suffering. As we've said, life involves suffering. An awareness that suffering arises through certain kinds of conditioning. In particular, it arises through our tendency to crave. Craving involves a wish for permanency, as well as a kind of an ego identification with aspects of the world that we find pleasant, and in opposition to parts of the world that we do not find pleasant or that we find painful. It involves an awareness, perhaps, that as we release our craving, we can also begin to see towards, anyway, a release in suffering. And eventually, as we continue our practice, this awareness will involve an awareness of the path, the things that we have to do, the practices we can use to diminish that suffering. But that's not the end of it. There's more besides. There is also a growing awareness that craving and ego identification involve or apply to views themselves. In other words, what we've been calling right view is also a sort of thing that we can crave. We can crave being right. We can crave being smart, being wise. We can ego-identify with particular views as being ours, as being the right ones. We can become ego-conceited, thinking that our views are better than those of our neighbors, that our understanding of the Dharma or the practice is better than somebody else's. And as a result, we get into arguments and disputes with other people about elements of the Dharma, among other things, of course, but let's just discuss the Dharma for now. We get into arguments and disputes about the Dharma. That leads towards enmity, it leads towards anger and hatred with other people. We can reflect back. If we're doing the practice the way we should reflect back then. If this happens to us, reflect back during a period of mindfulness. How does it feel to get into these kinds of arguments and disputes? Whether they're overt or simply an argument in our mind with somebody else, how does that make us feel? Is it positive or negative? Is it painful or pleasant? Is it skillful or unskillful? So the deepest understanding of right view is that craving and ego identification apply to views just as much as to anything else. In the early suttas, the Buddha gave a very famous simile, the simile of the raft, where he discussed the Dharma, his teaching, as akin to a raft that we use for a particular purpose, that is, to cross the river of samsara to the far shore of enlightenment and nirvana. When we get to the farther shore, however, we're not supposed to be clinging to that raft. We leave it back on the shore. That is, views, indeed even the views of the Dharma themselves, are simply for a particular purpose. They're not for clinging to, they're not for identifying with, and they're not for getting into arguments and disputes with other people about. So there's an enormous amount to practice with here, an enormous amount to be mindful of, either in formal mindfulness meditation or else just in daily life. To be mindful of our tendency towards clinging to permanence, clinging to certain kinds of ego identification, awareness of when we avoid things like old age, illness, death when it surrounds us, the ways in which we push those things away even though they're essential parts of life. And finally, we can practice mindfulness of clinging to and craving for views themselves, identifying with views themselves, thinking of ourselves as having the best views or better opinions than other people in an egoistic and kind of conceited way. Now, this is something we all get into. It's something that's absolutely normal to do. All of these mistakes that we make are absolutely normal, so we have to be aware of ourselves and not beat ourselves up over them. Simply be aware that part of our practice is to become aware of them when they happen, and to be aware of the tone of our mind when they arise, because the tone of our mind will allow us to see through them and begin to let them go. So in the next video, I will be talking about right intention, the next stage along the Eightfold Path. And when that video is ready, I'll leave a link to it up here on the screen. Before then, there'll be another video here that YouTube will give you that hopefully is one that you enjoy. Thanks so much. If you're getting something out of these videos of mine, consider taking a look at my Patreon page, which is linked up here on the screen and down below in the notes, and see if you want to help support the channel. Thanks again, and we'll catch you on the next video. And meanwhile, all of you, be well.